Thank you.
And it's rolling.
All right. Good morning. My name is Bonnie Skinner. I am a doctorate student at Liberty University. I am doing a presentation today for Education 734 on use of multimedia technologies in medical education and in teaching anatomy to students in health professions. The use of medical multimedia in medical education, including digital media and technologies, are being used more and more today by students at increasingly younger ages, with more increase in their use of technologies. The technologies they're using include iPads, computers, smartboards, laptops, and apps such as instant messaging, Snapchat, Facebook, TikTok, Instagram, and more. Educators need to be able to effectively use multimedia as well as consider safety for students in classrooms and online learning environments. So professional development and more research are needed to help teachers determine which type of multimedia technologies are most effective, and administrators need to be supportive of providing professional development and guiding teachers in the use of multimedia technologies. This is especially important today in our current situation and learning environment where more online learning is occurring and students are needing to use more multimedia technologies to be able to become educated and learn the topics that are required for their education. Health profession students particularly need to learn topics in anatomy and other important topics that they're going to need to retain for their future medical professions. So using evidence-based best practices to teach students is important. Technology and multimedia should be incorporated using the principles that we will discuss in this presentation. The cognitive learning theory, or CLT, answers the question how the human mind works while people are learning. The CLT helps try to understand the mental processes that are influenced by internal and external factors to produce learning in each individual. People mentally process information rather than just receiving and responding to external stimuli. Some principles must be applied to make learning effective. These include reducing extraneous processing, managing essential processing, and fostering generative processing. These are principles by Clark and Meyer, who discuss CLT when they say how mental processes transform information received by the eyes and ears in knowledge and skill into the human memory. This is a short video clip that will explain more about the cognitive theory of multimedia.
When you watch an educational video, it's hard to tell how much work and thought and research went into that video. In reality, a good educational video has been based on research that has been done over decades into the effect multimedia has on learning. In fact, Professor Mayer at UC Santa Barbara has drawn an ever-expanding set of principles from this ever-expanding body of research. The key principle is the multimedia principle, which states simply that words together with graphics, which is called multimedia, leads to better learning than simply words alone. In order to really understand why this would be, however, we first need a basis in cognitive theory. So in this video, we will discuss the cognitive theory behind multimedia learning, and by the end of this video, you should be able to describe the 3 key assumptions this is based on, as well as differentiate between the different types of processing that our brains utilize while learning from multimedia. Mayer's cognitive theory of multimedia learning is based on 3 assumptions. First, the dual channel assumption is that learners process information through separate channels based on whether it is audio or visual, and whether it is words or images. Information taken in via the visual channel can be written words or graphics, for example, while verbal words are taken in via the auditory channel. However, after they have been taken in, all words are then thought to be processed together in a separate channel from graphics. Interestingly, expert learners may have the ability to form mental pictures from words and mental descriptions of images, thus allowing these bits of information to cross over from one channel to the other. Second, the limited capacity assumption states that any channel has a limited capacity for material at one time. The visual channel may be overloaded by putting both graphics and significant text on the screen at once. Likewise, asking the brain to process both written and spoken text at the same time is not ideal. And third, the active processing assumption is that in order to learn, learners must pull out relevant bits of information from the information they receive and organize and integrate them with respect to each other and to their prior knowledge. Our brains do not have the ability to passively process all of the information we're given and then play it back word for word. Rather, we actively decide what parts of the material are relevant and important and weave those into our knowledge scaffolds. While trying to learn from different sorts of material or situations, our brains perform three types of processing. These are extraneous processing, which drains cognitive capacity without learning. Essential processing, in which we are pulling out relevant information from what we take in and organizing it in our working memory. And generative processing, in which our brains reorganize new information and build upon our prior knowledge scaffolding. Through use of instructional design techniques, we can alter what sort of processing our students go through. Our goal is to reduce extraneous processing, which wastes our cognitive capacity, manage essential processing, allowing us to take in information more efficiently, and foster generative processing, which leads to deeper understanding and retention. So how can we apply this cognitive theory to effective multimedia creation? Lots of research has led to Mayer's principles of multimedia design. Some of these principles work towards the goal of reducing extraneous processing, for example, the coherence, signaling, redundancy, spatial contiguity, and temporal contiguity principles. Some of the principles work towards the goal of managing essential processing, for example, the segmenting, pre-training, and modality principles. And some of the principles work towards fostering generative processing, for example, the personalization, voice, and image principles. To learn about these principles and how to apply them, if you haven't already, watch our companion video on Mayer's principles of multimedia design.
So we will now discuss some of the theories and principles behind some of these concepts that were presented to reduce extraneous processing, manage essential processing, and foster generative processing. So the behaviorist theories are based on rewards, and they think that having rewards are what motivates people. But in multimedia, we focus more on the cognitive learning theories versus the behaviorists, because in cognitive learning theory, goals and expectations lead to motivation rather than using rewards. So the learner's goals and expectations are what create tension to motivate them to act and to learn. So the cognitive load theory, using the constructivist principles that we just talked about, builds on the human information processing model, where we have sensory memory, working memory, and long-term memory. Information passes from the sensory or the external stimuli to the working memory, and it's either processed or discarded. Working memory can only hold about 5 to 9 chunks of information at a time. So for information to be processed into schemas to pass into the long-term memory, cognitive load must be considered to avoid cognitive overload. So using modality and redundancy principles can help improve learning and outcomes for students and increase satisfaction that should be considered and implemented in teaching. So the first is the spatial contiguity principle, which is aligning words to corresponding graphics. The words and graphics should not be separated. In medical education, we teach students anatomy using images to help identify body parts. So an example of a contiguity principle followed is labeling the parts of the brain or the different lobes by placing the words right next to the image on the brain part. An example of a violated contiguity principle where the words are not contiguous is given on the right side, where they have letters to the corresponding lobes and parts, and then the words are separated at the bottom of the page. This is what you want to avoid when teaching students. So you want to follow the example on the left to help them learn the information and retain it into the long-term memory. The next principle is the modality principle. This is where we're trying to avoid cognitive overload by using two separate channels, as mentioned in the video. So the two separate channels are the eyes and the ears. So you have the auditory and the visual processing. So you want to use two separate channels and avoid using information that processes both the information visually into the same channel or into the auditory channel using two different things. So you want to separate them out and have something that people can see and hear simultaneously, and then the eyes and ears are able to use the multimedia in the sensory memory and add it to the working memory through phonetic and visual processing channels. The redundancy principle states that we should try to use audio or text, but not both. Adding redundant on-screen text creates extraneous cognitive load. So an example in anatomy education would be teaching students about the blood flow through the heart. So having a graphic or a GIF like we have presented here shows that the blood enters the right part of the heart through the vena cava and goes into the right atrium and the right ventricle, where it does not have oxygen or is deoxygenated as represented by the blue arrows. It then goes to the lungs to pick up oxygen and comes back to the left side of the heart as represented by the red arrows. So by presenting information in this way and not adding words to the narration, it will help students make sense of the presentation by using the visual and auditory channels. You could further explain this by adding the different parts of the heart that the blood is traveling through, and go back and use the contiguity principle where we had the images with the words next to the part of the heart. So in a lesson plan for health profession students about the immune system, there are 4 different multimedia technologies that are used to help enhance student learning about the immune system. These will be explained in detail on the next few slides. So the first one is a formative assessment using Kahoot. The second one is an Ed puzzle with videos and questions. The next one is a collaborative listening and viewing guide for a video on how called the immune system at work. And then finally, a video enhanced rubric or a viewbrick to help students apply personal protective equipment properly. So the first one is Kahoot. This is a game that is used to help students show what they know, or what they have learned in a lesson, or to check for prior understanding or knowledge. So gamification is being used in education to facilitate formative assessment, and this is just one of the tools that can be used for this purpose. A study done by Ismail found that medical students benefited from using Kahoot because it motivated them to study, and they were able to determine the subject matter to be studied and be aware of what they had learned by demonstrating it using the game, and it was a promising tool for these students. So this is an example of a Kahoot that I created to help students learn about infection control or to check their understanding of safety and infection control in healthcare. So as you can see, the students will be given a game code and they will enter their name, and then in this case I presented it as a challenge so that they could do it at home in an online learning environment, and it would be open for a couple days and they would answer the questions. They get immediate feedback to their questions and answers to see if they've gotten the answer right. Then they can study the questions, or it also helps the teacher to understand the information that the students know from prior knowledge or touching on topics that need to be taught. Or you could present the Kahoot after you've done a lesson to see anything that you need to go back to reteach. The next example is the collaborative listening and viewing guide, where you can see in the first section is a preview of coming attractions. So that's kind of like the trailer to the movie clip that we'll be watching on the immune system at work. So it gives them a little background information. Then we check for prior knowledge of a topic that we learned about, where they identify the 5 types of white blood cells and complete a Venn diagram on bacteria and viruses prior to viewing the video. Then we watch the video and students can take notes in the notes section, and after that they would elaborate on the topics that they learned and the notes that they took with their group, either in a discussion board or in a classroom setting. They would have a discussion at their table groups, and then they would add any details that they missed that maybe their partners or table groups recorded in the notes, and then they could discuss more of the topics they learned in the video. Finally, they would have a homework assignment, which in this case was creating a pamphlet or brochure on HIV and AIDS that they would then share with the class. So this gives some technology and meaning to the video rather than just watching a video or a video clip and then expecting students to remember the information. The next technique that is a multimedia technology is called Edpuzzle, and this can be used for formative assessment as well, or it can be used to teach students on a topic and make sure they have understanding because it uses narrative. You can add questions, which can be short answer or multiple choice questions where the students would get instant feedback to their questions and answers, and they could rewatch the video or go back and check for understanding if needed. And there was a study done by Michelle in 2018 that discussed using Edpuzzle in undergraduate business and entrepreneurship classes, and she received positive feedback from the students who felt it helped them focus on the more important aspects of the videos, and they were more confident in their learning after using the embedded quizzes and using it for homework as well. So this is a short video showing you what Edpuzzle is, and then I will show you an example of an Edpuzzle that would be used for the lesson on personal protective equipment.
Want to create amazing video lessons in minutes? Edpuzzle is your missing piece. With Edpuzzle, you can choose from the millions of videos available from YouTube, National Geographic, TED Talks, Khan Academy, and more. You can also reuse ready-to-go video lessons made by other teachers or upload your very own teaching video. Then, use Edpuzzle's video editor to create your perfect lesson. Embed your own questions to check your students' understanding, cut sections to show your students only the most important parts of the video, and even record voiceover so you can explain concepts in your own words. Once you've finished, you can assign it to your students in just one click and prevent skipping to make sure your students don't miss a thing. When you want to check in on your students' progress, use Edpuzzle's hassle-free analytics to get all the information you need. See who still needs to watch the video, what your students responded, and their total scores. So remember, with Edpuzzle's free platform, you can make any video your lesson.
So an example of an Edpuzzle, as I mentioned, on personal protective equipment I chose one that a previous person had shared, and of course you can look and make sure that the questions and what you want them to see are appropriate, or as they mentioned, you can choose your own video and then you can add your own questions and your own clips and narration as it mentioned. So in this case, we're learning how to put on gloves, gowns, and eye protection, and you'll see some questions that are provided here.
Good afternoon. The skill I'm about to demonstrate is donning and removing PPE.
So the student would then answer the open-ended question, what does PPE stand for? If they weren't sure what it stood for, then they could continue to watch the video, or they could rewatch the part where it was to see if they had gotten the answer. So we would type our answer here, and then the teacher could go back and view what the students typed in the short answer.
PPE, of course, being your personal protective equipment. As you can see before me, I have a gown and we have gloves. Those are the only materials you need for this particular skill.
So now we're going to answer a question. Is PPE an example of medical asepsis or surgical asepsis? So we're going to choose surgical asepsis, and we're going to submit our answer, and that is the incorrect answer. So now the student knows that medical asepsis is the correct answer, and if they wanted to, they could go back and rewatch to see if that topic had been taught. So
I'll begin by removing my lab jacket. Open the package for the gown. Dispose of that one arm of the gown.
and you can see the student can move.
As opposed to a knot.
The student can move forward if they already feel like they have gotten the concept, or they can go back and rewatch. And then here is another open-ended question about why you want to tie it in a bow rather than a knot. So they would give you their answer. And then in the next question, you can see is a multiple choice question. So we would have gloves are placed under the cuff of the gown or over the cuff of the gown. And we'll choose over the cuff of the gown. And we got that question correct. So it gave us a green indicator that we had gotten it correct. So as you continue, you can see the questions you've gotten wrong, the questions you haven't answered, and the questions you've gotten right. And then, as it said, you can use the analytics to look at the information to see anything that the students need to review or work on that you can help them with. So with the next topic, which the next multimedia technology that was implemented into the lesson plan was a video enhanced rubric, or a ViewBrick. So this is rather than the rubric, which is a piece of paper that is usually used to perform a summative assessment or give students a grade on their performance, and as we have a task that they're performing, and we would have different levels of performance where we could check off whether the student had done something right or what they would need to review. And in the example that we just watched on personal protective equipment, you could have putting on the personal protective equipment, and the first part of the skill might be putting on the gown and making sure the student tied it in a bow and making sure they put the gloves over the top of the sleeves of the gown. And if they did all of that, of course, they would get the highest part on the rubric. Well, you can give students feedback using a rubric, but using a ViewBrick, you can then provide a video like we just did with the Ed puzzle, so that it can be more formative and the students can practice mastering the skills. So you want to have a video by a master who is performing the task without errors, as in the previous example where the nursing instructor was putting on the personal protective equipment. And this will help lead to complex skill mastery. So One of the elements that is useful is the video modeling that helps students learn to perform the skill. And there are 6 design guidelines that Ackermans and his other researchers recommend are useful to include in a rubric, and these include educational narrative and personalization, so you would go back and make it personal for your class or your students. The nonverbal script principle with narrative and voiceover, so as in the video we had the instructor talking. The distance principle by using the educational content and narrative on a storyline level, where the actors are showing mastery. The natural segmentation with no more than 4 to 7 skills and a pause or fade out to show reduced competition for the working memory. The students can also rewind or fast forward or replay, allowing them some learner control. And then lastly, we have hyper video design to allow the learner to self-explain what they've done by inserting self-explanation prompts called dynamic links. So this has been shown to be useful in a Dutch university where they conducted this research, and as you can see, it would apply technology to a previous rubric that was just a piece of paper that they would get feedback on, and so students would enjoy using this type of a formative assessment to be able to perform complex skills. A couple other examples that can be used in medical learning or anatomy include a interactive lecture in the dissection hall, which, as you can see, this is an example of a viz body or an image where students can move it and turn it and touch it and be interactive with a picture or a example of an X-ray, CT, MRI, and rather than just the instructor giving a lecture and showing examples with a cadaver, these are now more interactive, so it's more of a dynamic learning environment rather than passive. So a study done by Chimalgi found that the students were, it was more effective for teaching anatomy to first-year medical students, and so this was a evidence-based practice that could be applied to the typical medical education for students in medical school. Another useful tool for a study that was done in an organic chemistry classroom is online homework, and the students had a positive attitude about this online homework, and it used multimedia technologies, as we have demonstrated here in a couple different manners, such as the Kahoot challenge, and there were 7 principles that they used as a framework that included encouraging student-faculty contact, encouraging cooperation among students, encouraging active learning by giving prompt feedback, emphasizing time on task, communicating high expectations, and then respecting diversity. So that was incorporated into the online homework that was assigned to students, where again, they're able to use their different technologies and resources to learn about a task in any type of learning setting, but especially in the complex chemistry or anatomy or other health professions, medically related topics that we're talking about today. So that concludes the principles and technologies that I will be discussing today. So does anybody have any questions relating to any of the use of this or the principles discussed? And if there are no questions, these are the resources that were used for my presentation, and I appreciate your time and interest in this topic. Have a good day. Right on cue with the bell.